Hello, everybody. This is Melody LeBaron of Transforming Space, Transforming Self, Transforming Loss. And I'm here today with Joél Simone Anthony, who is a sacred death care and grief practitioner and a life insurance agent, a crematory operator, and she does the cosmetology, and she does the kind of work that we would normally think of as sort of an impersonal funeral director doing, but she does it with so much attention to detail and love and care, and with a spiritual perspective. So, Joél, can you tell us a little bit about how you look so young, and so how did you ever get involved in working with the dying, and how did you grow up thinking this was going to be something you were going to do?
Thank you so much for having me and for that introduction. So I grew up around funeral service and death care. I had an Uncle Mark who was about 19 years older than me. And from about the age of 7 or 8 years old, I was just morbidly curious. He would take us to the funeral home with him when we would spend spring break and summer break with him, and allow us to help out around the funeral home. And of course, with my morbid curiosity, I wanted to go into the embalming room, and he wasn't afraid to answer my questions or let me go explore and help him do things such as cosmetizing, dressing the deceased, riding in the hearse with him, and just learning about what death care was about. So that's how I got into this business.
Wow, it really was a family business.
Yeah, not necessarily a family-owned funeral home, but
Right,
just having family that worked
right.
in business there.
Wow. And so when when you were in high school and approaching college, um, did you think, oh, how can I? Were you like on the lookout for ways to make this a profession for yourself?
Honestly, no. When I was in high school, I attended a vocational school where I had my regular high school classes, but I was doing a master barbering and cosmetology course. And I knew that I was going to go to college for business because I knew I wanted to own my own business. But I honestly tried to run from funeral service for a very long time. And at the age of 26, after finishing college and having a job fresh out of college in a cemetery, I knew that I just couldn't run anymore. And I decided to enroll in mortuary school. So yeah, I thought I was going to own a hair salon or be a hospital administrator or something like that.
So I understand that you have um, a Caitlin Doherty, like, do you know who she is? She's written
I
so
do.
many books, and
I
yeah,
do.
you describe it as a morbid curiosity, but just from my perspective, it's like this physical awareness, this practical physical awareness. Both birth and death have these physical components, and yes, it's messy, but how do we support that? This would have been, I think, the kind of curiosity, if we lived in ancient times, we would have been the midwives of our communities, those who
Right.
help the dying and those who help the birthing parents. So, because the physical aspect of the process of bringing souls into this life and helping them depart needs to be attended well. Yeah. So, but you also work with the grieving. So, talk to us a little bit about, when you realized, okay, I'm going to mortuary school, I am going to work with the dying. How did working with the grieving come into that?
So prior to going to mortuary school, it's funny you mentioned birth and death. I was a baby photographer, and I would take pictures of newborn babies, and I was always most attached to and just interested in the mothers who had had miscarriages or stillbirths. And it got to the point where the nurses on the floor would specifically request that I work with those families because I just connected so much with them.
Wow.
So just realizing that there's so much that happens after a death occurs. In the industry, we refer to it as aftercare, where our journeys as funeral directors technically ends with the burial. There's a period of time, maybe a year and a half after, where the phone calls slow down. No one's checking on you and bringing you a casserole. And from my own experience with grief, I learned that that's really when people need the most support. And a lot of people either don't have access to healthcare where they can go seek professional help, or they just don't know how to ask for it, because grief is something that just completely takes over your entire life and changes everything. And so through my own experience and observing those who had grieved that were close to me, I just realized that there was this space that needed to be filled. And I love talking to, connecting with, and helping people. And I didn't want to limit that to just the preparation of the body, the funeral home, and then I never see you again. So I started just calling my clients maybe 2 or 3 months later and saying, how are you doing? Or is there anything that I could do for you? And it just led to these conversations that were similar amongst almost everyone.
Right, right. So talk to us specifically about, let's say that somebody has received a terminal diagnosis. Mm-hmm. And they are the kind of person that they don't want to leave things to the last minute, and they don't want to burden their family, and they don't want their family to get it wrong. They know what they want. So let's say they find you somehow. What can you help them through? What are the decisions that you can help them through? And then we'll talk about, after they passed, what can you help their loved ones as far as the grieving process?
Well, in addition to being a licensed funeral director and embalmer, I'm also a licensed health and life, sickness and life insurance agent. So I actually help clients plan out their funerals, from what they want to wear, who they want at their service, what type of flowers they want, things you don't think about, where your important vital information is, the deeds to your home. And then I also help them get their life insurance set up so that their funeral costs are covered if they're able to prepay or begin prepaying for their services. In addition to that, I also have a support network of estate attorneys and, just other professionals that can come in and handle things like last wills and testaments and living wills for the care that they want done to their body. Since you mentioned being terminally ill, right. Some people not want to live on a respirator, so right. They make those decisions, and I just help them plan everything that they would want done at the end of their lives to take that burden off of them and their family.
Oh, that's beautiful. And there's a number of decisions that they have to go through, including who writes the obituary, and right. Like I've worked with clients that I've helped them write the obituary. Yes. And they love that idea.
Yes. I always tell people that you can tell your own story. This is the story of your life. What parts do you want included that nobody else knows about but you? What was funny? What made you cry? Who means the most to you? And what message do you want to leave behind for those that love you? I encourage people to write letters to all of the people that mean a lot to them, even if it's only a sentence long. It doesn't have to be 4 or 5 pages, but I encourage letters and lots of photos. And my favorite part about the photos is hearing the story behind each picture. Right. And that's one thing I encourage families to do when they can, when they're together, is to open up the photo album, because right. So many stories and so many things are going to come out that you just may not know about.
Before my grandmother died, and this was in the early 90s, I went up to southern Alberta, Canada to see her for the last time. And I got a video camera there, and we videotaped her with me looking through the photo album with her and asking questions about who were these people, because none of us knew. Right. And so now we still have those stories. And of course, now it can be digitized and shared amongst all the family members. Yeah.
Yes.
Beautiful. So I love that you help clients because, you know, in what you're describing is what I would consider a part of the emotional process of dying, right?
For sure.
We've got the physical process of dying. We want to make sure those needs are handled, but then we've got the mental process where you kind of go from shock and denial through anger and bargaining and depression, and then into acceptance. And then once acceptance has been reached, if there's time, you've got all of this leave taking, acts of kindness to do for your family, of leaving a photo legacy or a digitized, you know, video, leaving your those letters you mentioned, having those last conversations. That's all so important. And I have teachers and mentors who actually made the decision to, in addition to writing their obit, um, they left a video for the funeral service.
Oh, wow, that's beautiful.
So they literally spoke at their own celebration of life.
That's beautiful. And another decision that I've been surprised by is that a lot of people are unsure about what they want done with their bodies when they pass away. Not everyone is open and closed on a casket, you know, wanting to be in a
Right.
casket, no pun intended, or being cremated. So just having conversations with people about what embalming entails and whether or not they have to be embalmed, and knowing that the alternatives like natural burial and shrouding, or what cremation involves and the options there with, I always stumble over this word, but water cremation,
Yes.
hydrogen alkalization.
Right.
Um, so just talking about the different options there and just educating people is a very big passion of mine.
So one of the questions I have for you, Joelle, because you know, I'm one of the younger boomers, and I'm definitely someone who's going to do it differently, you know,
Right.
because I saw the older generation all do the same thing that's
Yeah.
been done since the Civil War, of embalming the body, putting the body in this expensive coffin, and then that goes in a concrete vault. And from my perspective, I'm really an environmentalist. That's too heavy an environmental burden for me to leave behind.
Okay.
And so I did some research and found what was going to be the least, first of all, the least costly, and
Mhm.
then the least costly to the environment. And then I look at both of those things together. Well, it's different in every area, right? So so right now your funeral home is in downtown Atlanta.
It is.
What, for people who live in the Atlanta area, what would you tell them if they were concerned about least costly and or least costly to the environment? What would you tell them their best options are?
So least costly at this point would definitely be cremation. Least costly to the environment would be green burial. And a lot of people don't know that there are two places that you can, actually three places that you can have a green burial. One is in outside of Alpharetta, Milton, Georgia. They
Wow.
have a green burial or a green cemetery there. There's another one, a monastery in DeKalb County outside of Covington, I
Mhm.
believe, or is it Conyers, where they offer green burial options. And then there's the actual Big Green Conservatory right outside of Jacksonville, Florida. So those
Okay.
are options, depending on how far you want to travel. But definitely cremation. Water cremation just became legal in Georgia last year. There are a few funeral homes offering that, not necessarily in Metro Atlanta, but outside of Metro Atlanta.
So for people who don't know what that is, would you just explain the the process?
The simplest way to describe it would be flameless cremation. Water is used to, I don't want to say dissolve, but break down the body, as opposed to fire breaking down the body. And a lot of people are nervous about being burned and, you know, the smoke and the emissions from the crematory, which is very minimal.
Mhm.
But a lot of people just don't like the idea of being set on fire. So water cremation is a more mentally friendly option.
Right. And here in Western North Carolina, we've also got projects doing research on composting of human remains. So that may be in another 10 years, another option that's very environmentally friendly.
For sure. And there's several companies that offer burial shrouds and wicker caskets and things like that. I know for the cemetery in Milton, they do require at least a shrouding. A lot of people want to know if they can just be put into the ground naked. And unfortunately, a human body must be covered with something before going into the ground.
So one of my teachers, Colin Tipping, the author of all the Radical Forgiveness books and work, he passed from cancer last year, and he made the decision for cremation. And he and his wife are both artists, and they painted. So they purchased a cardboard box and they painted these beautiful, beautiful images that represented for him what he felt like his soul was moving toward.
Yes.
And it was stunning, just beautiful. Tell me, have you seen that being done before?
I've seen so many exciting and just interactive things being done with families. I know personally when my Uncle Mark passed away, the gentleman who introduced me to funeral service, we got markers, Sharpie markers, and wrote all over his casket. I mean, the entire thing was covered with just words of love. I've worked with clients where their parents may have been artists or they did art projects together, and we've actually taken ashes from their deceased loved ones and mixed it into the paint and just made beautiful paintings that they can hang up in their home. I'm all about alternatives and again that aftercare. What can we do with families to really celebrate the essence of individuals in unique ways that are meaningful and helpful through the grieving process?
So let's talk about someone, you know, you can obviously work with the dying, it sounds like from soup to nuts, helping them plan everything out and make sure that's paid for, and just, you know, give their sort of emotional legacy gifts. And so after the service, after the celebration of life or the funeral service, then you've got the grieving spouse or the grieving parents or the grieving children. Like, how do you work with them to support them? Because as we both know, the grief journey is not something that American culture really has some maturity and literacy about.
So I recently, this year, I debuted a project entitled The Grief Kit, or a product. And what it is, as you mentioned, a lot of my practice is based in spirituality. I'm from the heart of the Gullah and Geechee culture, which is Beaufort, South Carolina. And what I did was incorporate a lot of what I've been taught and shown culturally about celebrating life and death and even working through grief, and put it into a box. And I'll make sure you get photos and the link and everything.
Okay,
But,
great.
I do a lot of online consultations, and I was before COVID doing in-person consultations and working through this grief kit, which takes a spiritual approach to the transformative journey of grief. We work a lot with the heart chakra. Sorry. And it just has several little small spiritual tools that are mental triggers for processing grief from a spiritual perspective. And I mean, I've worked with clients from all over the world with this. I'm not limited to the United States, thanks to things like Zoom and Google Meet. But part of the kit is, you know, a book that deals with the chakras, mainly the heart chakra, which is where we hold a lot of our grief and loss. So I work with clients through this kit, and I just do my best to be a support system when needed.
So one of the things that I have noticed when I do grief work with my clients is that many times when there's been what I call an unintegrated or uninitiated loss, where they really, the grief kind of has gone within, or it's gotten stuck, or they really haven't had facilitation to move the grief. Basically, it affects your mental state, it affects your emotional state, and eventually will affect the physical. And what I find when people do their grief work, they create time and space, and like you say, working through this grief kit, what happens when they catalyze their grief is it becomes life force. They have mental clarity, they can do projects. Many times things have piled up around the house and there are piles of clutter. Now they can address those very quickly. Tell me what you've noticed with people you've worked with.
As we were talking a little bit before, I don't even have to reach for clients for that. You know, I've had experience within my own family where my grandfather was somewhat of a hoarder, and he collected newspapers and magazines, and it took my grandmother a very long time. He passed away in 2008. As early as Thanksgiving, we were still clearing things, you know, as recent as Thanksgiving, we were still clearing things out of her house that my grandfather had collected over the years because she wants to now sell the house.
Right.
So she's just having that level of acceptance, like you were saying, not being able to address those stacks of magazines because there's an emotional and psychological attachment to my grandfather's presence, or getting rid of vehicles. He had all of this heavy duty equipment because he worked on homes and farms. So getting rid of tractors and dump trucks and utility vehicles, it was almost cathartic for her because she was releasing those earthly attachments to his physical presence. And just working with clients, as you said, when we start out, you know, I'll notice a bunch of stacks or piles in the background. And each week, there are less and less piles because there's more space being created to process emotions and process grief. And I've noticed that even with my grandmother, once the piles were gone, she seemed lighter.
Oh, how beautiful. Yeah. How absolutely
so
beautiful.
I think there's a lot of value in what you do as far as clearing space, because it clears space.
Yes.
As below, so, or as above, so below. As
exactly.
within,
Exactly.
so without.
You know, 20 years ago, the name of my business was Transforming Space, Transforming Self, because I realized you can't do one without the other happening. And then, you know, this year I've expanded it to be Transforming Space, Transforming Self, Transforming Loss, because the transforming loss piece was literally the key to unlock some of my clients' capacity to get their clutter cleared and get their environment handled. It had to be an integration of a past loss. That was the key that opened that door. Yeah.
And many of my clients haven't even suffered loss from death. It could be the loss of a job or divorce. I mean, we experience grief in so many different ways, the loss of a relationship, and we get stuck in the grieving process because grief is defined as the experience of loss, and loss takes several different forms. Death just happens to be the lane I've been called to, but grief is universal.
So that brings up a question I have for you about COVID-19. So we're now well into a pandemic, and I'm sure I would love to hear you talk about how COVID has affected not just, you know, your work with the dying, with the funeral business, but also with the grieving, and how, because it feels to me in some ways that we're collectively grieving.
We definitely are. I feel as if it takes three main forms, Ms. Melody. The first form is that we've lost our sense of reality. The world that we knew prior to March of 2020 does not exist anymore, and it will never exist. On a mental plane, on a physical plane, and on a spiritual plane, we've shifted. And that's a fact. And that is a shift that people are processing in different ways and on different levels. There's no there's no even playing field anymore.
And on different timelines,
On
depending
different
on
timelines, for sure.
how challenging it is for you to integrate this. Yeah.
Exactly. Very, very true. The second way is that specific to death, it's changed the way that we grieve, because the whole purpose of a funeral service is for community and for those who are experiencing the loss to receive support from family, friends, neighbors, coworkers, strangers. You know, we can't really do that anymore. Um, I've seen a lot of elderly people who funerals are their social setting. They attend funerals to talk to people. They can't do that anymore. And a lot of depression has set in, a lot of loneliness and isolation has set in, and that has intensified the grieving process, especially for those who are experiencing first and secondary loss. And the third way is that we're having to become more creative in the way that we celebrate life when it's time to actually celebrate the life of someone who's passed away. We have things now like virtual funerals, drive-through funerals are now becoming popular again. It's definitely changed the way that we in the industry can support people. A lot of my arrangement conferences recently have been virtually. And that's something I've never really done before in my career. And I mean, I've only been in the industry as a funeral director for 2 years, but I've worked in the industry for over 10 years, and I've never seen the computers used so much. And the death care industry is really having to catch up because we were behind technologically.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's changed everything.
Yeah. So what advice do you have for family members who whose loved ones are in the hospital and they're not allowed in, they're not allowed to be with their loved ones? This is a question I get asked a lot. I'm wondering what you offer your clients.
Um, I say seek out support from your support systems. Um, I had an experience earlier this year where a very close loved one was in the hospital with blood clots. And of course, I couldn't go visit. And it was literally a life or death situation. So the just the anxiety on top of they're not answering their phone. Did something happen? Or it's been an hour and they haven't called me back. Try, and I know this is going to sound so cheesy, and not everyone is in a situation where their loved one is going to come home, sadly, but try to be as positive as you can. Don't allow negative thoughts to control your emotions. And when you're having those moments of anxiety, don't isolate yourself in them.
Yeah. You know, I feel like it's really more important now than at any time in my lifetime that we have guides when we're just like the birthing parents need to take those natural childbirth classes, need to have the midwife or the doula working with them. And by the way, I have 5 children, and each one of them were born in a different state with different doctors. So I had 4 male, GYN OBs. And then I had a midwife with my 5th child. I learned more about my body. I learned more about the birth process. And with each one of those 4 children before, I had taken a natural childbirth class. But I learned more about the birth process and about my body from the midwife. And it was by far the most empowering experience. So we've got to have guides right now for the dying and the grieving process. And
Sure.
so I would say, obviously Joél is someone who can be a good guide if you are in a grieving process. Now, you mentioned earlier, Joél, that grief doesn't just happen to us when we lose a loved one to death. Many people have been furloughed or laid off, or they've been fired. They've lost their jobs completely. Restaurants have closed, businesses closed. So do you work with people who are grieving that kind of a loss, the loss of an identity?
I really do. And it honestly surprised me that people were reaching out for that. And I wrote a blog about losing a business years ago. I can't even remember how long ago. That has been my most popular blog on my website consistently since April.
Wow.
I think it went to number 3 in July when things were starting to go back up.
Right.
But since things are coming back down, it's right back at number 1. And that was a message to me that I needed to expand beyond just the death circle, because grief is universal. And I have to just say, I'm not a mental health professional. I have no training in mental health treatment other than what I've been taught in mortuary school as a paraprofessional. But I do believe that I have a gift for working with people through their loss on a spiritual level. So
Right.
I think that's very important to understand. And right now, we are in a very big spiritual vortex where a lot of people are awakening to different gifts and ideas. And I also have a gift for business. People are wanting to know, or having to know, how to incorporate their creativity and their natural gifts to make money for themselves. So I try to keep all of those things in mind and help people think outside of the box, so to speak, both in death and in life. So.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate being able to talk to someone who cares about, um, one of the things in my book is about making the dying person, rather than the medical system, the locus of control, right? So, when I first gave birth, it was all feet up in stirrups, presenting it for the convenience of the doctors. With that midwife, number 5, oh my goodness, it was all about my comfort and my convenience. I was the locus of attention, not the medical system. And I think it's very important that we do this for the dying and their caregivers, and that we do this for the grieving. And that's really what you're talking about, is allowing yourself to be the locus of attention and allowing yourself to receive support. And sometimes, and the reason I wanted to do this with you, I had heard you speak on a panel discussion, and I thought, wow, there are people who don't even know what they need. They've gone through a loss, but and for a friend to call them and say, hey, I'm here for you if you need anything, but they don't even know how to verbalize what they need. And maybe what they need is a grief kit, and they need a guide to walk them through their grief process.
I appreciate that. That's a huge compliment. And I'm just here to serve however I can help. I don't know all the answers. I don't have all the answers, but I have a lot of experience, and I have a passion for helping people through the grieving process.
Yeah. Is there anything that you can share? We talked a little bit before we started recording about it, in ancient times, our ancestors, there were the midwives who helped the dying and the birthing, and who facilitated these kinds of transformations. We're talking about changes of identity. Um, and is there anything else that you want to add about your own spiritual traditions, or the traditions of the people that you work with?
Well, personally, from a cultural perspective, as I mentioned, I'm from Beaufort, South Carolina, which is the central hub for the Gullah and Geechee culture, which is the original African people, where people from Africa were bought on slave ships to South Carolina and then sold to go throughout the United States. And being from that area, a lot of our original traditions are still in place. And this is something that I didn't realize was unique until I started working in the death care industry. And one of the biggest differences that I've seen in my culture versus the way a lot of the United States and Western world does death is that we don't shy away from death. When someone dies, the family plays a very big role, not only in the preparation, but in the preparation of the deceased as they're transitioning, if possible, as well as afterwards. Children are brought into environments that some may see as gruesome. Like my uncle took me into the funeral home. It eliminated that fear of the unknown. And I didn't realize that that was such a huge part of healing until I experienced loss. And we were allowed to be there with my grandfather and afterwards, and have such a, like you said, an integrated role in his preparation. So I would encourage everyone to not shy away from conversations about death. Not everyone is going to be comfortable going into a funeral home or preparing their deceased loved one, but just instill your own traditions and incorporate as much of your family and your loved ones into the process as possible. Try not to shy away from things, because that's how we build fear and anxiety. Death is not a comfortable subject for anyone to talk about. We all have fears, we all have hesitations, but the more conversations that we have and the more honest that we are, the less we have to fear.
And outcomes, when fear drops, outcomes are better, right?
Yes.
So being uncomfortable in those conversations is going to result in a better outcome.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been so informative, and I appreciate everything you've shared. Will you just give us your website, and then
sure.
I'll put all of the other things in the links underneath in the blog post.
Okay. My website is thegravewoman@gmail. I'm giving you my email address: www.thegravewoman.com.
Right. And
Sorry.
then if people want to email you, it's thegravewoman@gmail.com. Okay. So thank you so much, Joél Simone Anthony. It has been just a joy and a privilege to talk with you today. And thank you so, so much.